All right, it looks like it's 3 o'clock, but we do have a number of people that are still streaming in. But because we have a really busy agenda, I want to make sure that we get started so that we can cover everything that we need to. So thank you for joining us for today's March 17th Citywide Advisory Committee meeting. We will go ahead and get kicked off with the meeting. We just wanted to let everybody know that we are well into our community engagement and our community outreach. We've heard a lot of great discussion in regard to Module 2, and then even information that goes back to Module 1. So that will get us started. We also wanted to introduce to you our new Planning and Development Services Director, Timothy Keene. He actually goes by Tim Keene, but he is not quite here with us yet. So we may go ahead and flip-flop items number 2 and 3 and really kind of talk about some of the things that we have been hearing, not only from our community, but also kind of a debrief on, what do you guys think about the city council work session? Does that excite you? Does that concern you? Does it align with where you think the city needs to be? So I think that'll be a valuable discussion to get us kicked off. And then once we then have an opportunity to meet Tim, then we'll be able to go ahead and roll into the presentation as well as discussion. So, Don, do you want to go ahead and bring up the presentation? And then it'll allow us to kind of look at what we're looking for today and then get us kicked off with, what did we hear about the city council? What are we thinking about that?
Can you see that?
Yep, it looks good.
Woo-wee. Now I'll try to get the, well, we can start looking at it, but I'm going to try to get some windows to go down so I can actually start it on the presentation. So there we go. Okay. Tell me when to advance, Andrea.
I think that's a really good point for us to really stop and then kind of debrief on the city council presentation, and just to give us an idea of where we've been. So we kicked off the public engagement event ultimately with an initial meeting with the city council, and they told us at that time that they had an opportunity to take a look at Module 2, but they had some ideas and they wanted to share those with us. And so we took that opportunity to have a conversation with them. And then we wanted to have a public work session as well, so that the community heard what our council was looking for and how they would move forward. And so they did that on March 1, and I went ahead and forwarded that meeting video to you. So you should have had an opportunity to take a look at that. And then I know that a couple of you have said, hey, would you mind forwarding that presentation? And so I have forwarded that presentation to you as well. So that just kind of outlines a couple of the topics from what we heard from them. So, but we, the important part is, what do you think? Are they right on? Do you have anybody want to kick us off? Kelly.
Okay, I'll be the brave one to dive in on this one. So I have a lot of mixed feelings about it, to be honest with you. I was a little disappointed by some of their comments. because Lisa talked about, she didn't like neighborhood protection, and that means we're excluding people. And it's like, well, would her feelings about that section be different if we didn't say exception and it was something else? Because she really didn't talk about what the content was of that. Patrick did, and I was a little concerned by the fact he said, well, there's nothing in, the state constitution or the laws that says that we have a right to sunlight, and so he was nervous or concerned about adding things into our code that gave rights to people that aren't, prescribed. And so, I feel like we're looking at it we're all looking at this in a holistic way about how can we have growth in this city. And, and in my neighborhood, I'm particularly concerned about infill development. I think a lot of the other neighborhood people that are in this discussion are concerned about that. And so, I feel like that effort is kind of just being pushed aside. And it was really all about, well, how can we just build mass without thinking about these other things? I don't think, looking at setbacks or talking about, building something that's an infill development that blends well with other things in the neighborhood. I mean, I don't think that I think that's like the intent of this process of how can we make the city of the future, build well off of what we had in the past. And I mean, my perception was a lot of their comments completely poo-pooed that. I don't know if the other folks felt the same way.
No, I think that's a really good introduction. Roberta, and then Ian, do you want to share your thoughts? Roberta, are you with us?
Okay. Apologies. So it was interesting listening to Kelly because we've seen each other at some of these meetings. And so at another time, Kelly, I may have to ask you to clarify some of that. I listened to the city council. I know in the past that P&Z has briefed city council as we've gone along because I caught a couple of them. City council is sort of a one point. I did hear them addressing density and parking issues. I'm not sure everybody is in that same holistic vein that Kelly mentioned, as far as how we address it all in the big city, in the city as a whole. In the meetings I've gone to, you hear a lot, and this is above and beyond city council, you hear a lot about density and parking, and both sides of that, because that's a big concern. And on the flip side, you hear about affordability and keeping the feel of Boise. In truth, city council didn't have any solutions for me in particular, except to, my impression after listening to that is that there was a lot of good discussion. There was no solutions, and direction to P&Z was to go back and do some more work. And I was presuming that doing more work would involve us as the committee and some of the feedback. It's difficult. I find it difficult when we talk about this holistic nature of the city. Well, I totally agree with that. We've got to come up with some consensus. Each area has different issues, so it's just sensitive. So that's pretty much my basic impression.
Thanks, Roberta. How about Ian, followed by Drew, and then Francis?
Thanks, Andrea. I would kind of, to piggyback off of what Roberta said and what Kelly said,
that is,
I think that,
we submitted,
we've been having a conversation. I just realized I'm still muted, sorry. Anyway, to piggyback off what Roberta and Kelly were saying,
So
I think we've been having this conversation
I
with Dawn and Andrea about,
It's like 2 to 3
know,
inch stone.
hearing everybody and kind of having an approach that promotes growth, but it also, is careful to not change existing neighborhoods. The feedback that I felt the city council gave was go denser, go bigger, go,
retry it and show
go
those
for
as
it. I don't
8-inch
know.
walls.
I hear what they say. I don't know how to react to that,
all it
given
does
the
is
kind of
just
different
shrink the
conversations
wall
we've been
4
having
inches.
internally. One thing that I thought was striking, and take it whatever direction you will, is the comment from Elena Craig that said she looks at how the zoning code is written today or how it's being rewritten. And it's almost as if it's being written for the Boise that we currently have, not for the future Boise, I guess, that we're trying to achieve. So I thought that was interesting.
I would think so.
Thank you.
I think I'm up. Andrea, is that right?
Yeah.
Just real quick, I think I heard some similar things that I've been hearing that are encouraging, that there's just more work to do. And like Roberta said, I hope some of that additional work continues to come to this committee. I think it might have been Councilmember Clegg's observations about some of the zones and more potential within certain zones. And I just like to kind of echo that, from my reading, I could be wrong, but I think some of the conversion map would actually result in some immediate, like large amounts of nonconformities in certain areas. Take Lusk, for example, with mixed use street. I think just about anything built over there in the last decade would have been taller than what the zone allows. If you look at Park Center, mixed use neighborhood, certainly are in that situation where I think potential in that corridor or what has been built in the past is already outside of some of the confines of that zone. And then on a residential level, I think maybe it was mentioned R3 that we're not differentiating these zones quite enough. And I think just as a general message, that was kind of my takeaway, is that there's more work to do at a prescriptive level of how the zones can be both applied, but also massaged a bit more.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Drew. Francis, do you want to take the stage?
Sure. Thank you, Andrea. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the staff for your, I guess I'd have to say it's resilience. I only attended last night's meeting, and I hope to attend the next 2 neighborhood meetings. But your resilience in going around the city and making these presentations and fielding the comments from residents who, I don't know if yesterday was typical, but it seemed to me that the residents were very angry, skeptical, and distrusting of the city. And so what it felt like in terms of the city council meeting and their comments, I was actually really dismayed at the gap that seems to exist between at least some of the neighborhoods and where the city council is directing planning and zoning to go. Because I've felt all along that planning and zoning is doing a good job of considering existing neighborhoods, providing the appropriate setbacks, being conscious about height requirements, and not putting neighbors, existing neighborhoods in the shadow of tall buildings. But what it sounded like on the city council discussion was they were brushing that aside and saying that you are not being aggressive enough, not going tall enough, not going dense enough, and forget about some of the setbacks. It's okay to go clear to the curb, basically. And so I was pretty alarmed that we have a community engagement process that's moving along. City council is giving you a really specific direction to go that seems at odds with where probably a lot of homeowners feel the city should be going. And it feels like a runaway train to me. If residents watch that city council meeting, I think some of them are going to say, you aren't listening. All of these community engagement conversations are theoretically to take the input of residents and then come to further dialogue and discussion before rushing ahead. And it didn't feel like that with the city council meeting to me.
Thank you. And we have a couple more hands raised. So we have Richard, Brad, and then Esther.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Andrea, for coming last night. It is true that there is a lot of anger out in our area, as I think it's true with a lot of the kind of edges of Boise. The way I see the city council response as well, that was the response of, a city council at 5 out of 6 live, a couple of miles of each other in the north end and east end. And I would love it if we could have a Hyde Park out in my neighborhood. And if simply by kind of following, kind of letting, relaxing some of these standards, we get Hyde Park. But we know we don't get that. What we get is proposals kind of that Francis mentioned, where there have been no step downs. And it's taken huge battles, 2 years of, fighting and hundreds of people involved and tons of research and alternate proposals in order to get something as simple as step downs at the end. And that does make a big difference. And it is that interface between existing areas and, say, the kind of densities that the city's hoping for along State Street. It is, maybe we can do it, but it's not easy. And just simply kind of to brush aside those concerns as if we all have Hyde Park everywhere, it's just not realistic. And I think I look at this process and I think, well, in a couple of years, we're going to have city council that is representative across the city. And I feel like the city council is kind of trying to rush this through when we have 5 out of 6 are in the north and east ends, and really I don't think really have much of an understanding of what goes on in the rest of the city. So, and also, I also found the remark about sunlight from Badgent problematic when we start referring to what rights property owners or residents have if they're given such rights explicitly by the state. How many issues in our comp plan in Blueprint Boise would be impossible to become ordinance if we were to apply that criteria? I think it's, would be almost everything. So I find that a very disturbing kind of lens to look at how we can codify those elements of Blueprint Boise that are essential to us. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Brad?
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
I could probably echo many of the comments that Richard and Kelly and Francis and them have said about our concern with trust. I know we've been at this for 2 years, and I thought we were going a little too far on some of it already. And then to see the city council, 6 people, push right past us was really disheartening. I tried to watch it again today, and it bothered me. You know, they had mentioned, this protecting the neighborhoods, and I think it was said that we have a police force, and that's the only protection that the homeowners require. There's no regard to protecting their lifestyle or their homes, their way of life, whatever. That kind of bothered me a bit. And I tried mentioning this last night. Well, let me say, I mentioned that 2 weeks ago or a week ago. I mentioned that, the city council was doubling down on stuff to the city council, and they got angry with me. Like, that's not what they were saying. And I was really confused by that. Transparency. I mean, at least be straight up with what you're trying to do. I mean, I've confronted you on your agenda, and you look down at me like I'm talking out my butt. And the trust that the city is lost here is incredible. I've been to a lot of these meetings, and nobody's understanding what's going on or why their voice isn't being heard. The one example that really bothered me is because I actually watched a planning and zoning meeting the other day, and it was in regards to the project on State Street, the five level apartment building. And they had many homeowners right there asking me, they're not denying that we need the housing, the product, whatever it may be, but there were some simple things that they could have done to appease some of these homeowners, especially the sunlight. I mean, you're blocking the sun out from one house permanently. And I understand probably what you're doing because I'm in structural engineering, and I understand why it's probably expensive to maybe tier the building. Multiple roofs are probably, or cost more, but there was no effort made to protect that neighborhood. Not to mention the parking. I don't even want to get into the parking. That's horrifying. But they weren't protecting that neighborhood in any way. And what I see with that is it's just an example for the developers to come in and do what they need to do and whatever they want. And the city to set an example like that scares me. So that's my take.
All right, we have Esther and then Byron. And then I would love for us to transition quickly to Timothy Keane, because I know he has another meeting that he needs to get to. So I'd love for you guys to be able to meet him and hear what his vision is, because I think he's going to take a lot of these thoughts and really place them together based on his past experience. He's a very kind and talented man. I think he's going to really listen to the city council, us as a committee, as well as the community, and the council. So
thanks,
Esther?
Andrea. Can you guys hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. First, I want to thank the city staff who has been at these face-to-face meetings. I've seen some very disrespectful behaviors, and I understand its frustration by the public, but I guess it's unfortunate that sometimes it is directed to staff in the way that I have seen it happen the last two in-person meetings that I've attended. I definitely agree. The city council may be looking at this from a very different lens. But I guess I just want to remind everyone that we are growing. And as much as I would have loved to have kept the Boise from 1995 in some respects, we are not there anymore. And so we, a lot of what I've heard and a lot of what I previously involved in planning and zoning public comment opportunities really emphasized was like, keeping Boise the way that it is. And we should, and we do have an obligation to the extent possible to maintain those aspects of the city that we cherish. But at the same time, I feel that we need to be realistic and think about, if we are going to grow, what does that look like? And that's it.
Those are some excellent points. Thanks, Esther. And Byron?
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, thank you, Esther. That you echoed a lot of my thoughts. I think the city staff that has been, excellent and resilient in the face of quite a lot of frustrated and angry neighbors in a lot of these neighborhood meetings. I wrote it in the comments here, much better than I can usually speak them out, but I'll go ahead and just say it out loud too. Getting one particular perspective from one particular type of Boisean is what we usually see in these neighborhood meetings. They tend to be attended by older homeowners, people who are housing secure, and people who have a lot of what I would call growth stressors. They're stressed out about growth. They're stressed out about the future of Boise, and they don't know where to put a lot of that fear and anger energy. And so they have a tendency to show up at neighborhood meetings with the intention of sometimes disrupting, sometimes being as loud as possible in trying to change the temperature of the room or the conversation that's happening as part of the presentation. I've seen multiple things happen. And so that's been pretty frustrating as well, specifically because I know that's not the only Boisean that's out there. Those are the Boiseans that tend to attend those neighborhood meetings. But there are many other, possibly hundreds of other types of Boiseans that we haven't heard from, and or at least we as a group may not have heard from, and certainly haven't heard from in the neighborhood meetings, because their primary method of responding to the comments from module 1 or 2 are likely, we don't have access to those. They're probably emailed, they're probably texted to city staff. So we don't hear from those people as a group either. So it's easy to see, it's easy to become convinced that what we're hearing is nothing but negativity, nothing but anger from Boiseans as a whole, when that's really not the case. It is interesting to me that so many of the questions and confusions that lie around these neighborhood meetings tend to surround the particularities of a zoning code. And I think that's easy to understand, because what we're asking people to do is get up to speed very quickly on something that's very close to a legal document. I mean, it is a legal document in a certain sense. It's difficult for the average Boisean to know how to respond to things like setbacks or height limits and density limits. So in a way, I do understand where they're coming from. I understand where their anger and fear is coming from, but so much of that has to do with just this lack of information or lack of ability to kind of comprehend the plan itself and understand that growth is happening anyway.
Thanks, Byron. And Roberta, if you want to give a really quick comment, and then we'll hand it over to Tim for a few minutes and he can introduce himself.
Thanks, Andrea and Al. And I've been to all the meetings. Unfortunately, I missed yesterday's. I'm out of state. They are very focused on the areas. One of the things that this may be more of a question of when we go back to things on how to improve modules 2, and if necessary, is, the meeting that struck me that might have been closest to yesterday's was the Foothills meeting, where people are concerned about open space areas. And I'd like to, and that's open space, private land, not public land, at some point have the opportunity to hear what are the other options for those areas. to preserve them, because we haven't really delved into that. And I've seen some other options, and I'm certainly not the expert. And, you know, there's been a lot of great comments from all of these meetings and from the folks in the advisory committee itself. But I also see what Brian's saying is, you know, when you go to certain meetings, you're in a vacuum and you're not hearing everybody's concerns, nor are we hearing solutions. And that's the part that I get concerned about, because I personally applied to this committee because I wanted to see this zoning done with a group that was more than developers, as was done previously. And my concern is that we don't kick this down the road, that we do meet our obligations of finishing the rewrite of the rezone. So thanks for the conversation. I'll add one more thing. And, you know, Zoom is really, really super convenient. And if there's time at the end, and if I'm still connected, I'd love to see if maybe small groups of us could get together on more informal basis, because I think there's a lot of good ideas, but we don't often have the time to delve into them on these phone calls. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you. And then if other people do have comments, you know, we may have additional discussion time that we can dive in. But I want to introduce Tim Keane. He is the new Planning and Development Services Director with the City of Boise. He's been with us for a little over a week. He has been very interested in taking a deep dive into the zoning code rewrite, and he's actually been able to attend multiple our community engagement events. So he has a really great handle on what our community is saying, what the process looks like, and I'll let you hear from him what he's thinking. So go ahead and take it away, Tim.
Thank you, Andrea. And I'm sorry that I'm meeting some of you for the first time here on Zoom. I did get a chance to meet some of you, however, last night and at the meeting in the foothills last Wednesday, which was my first day with the city of Boise. I'll start by just thanking you for participating in this group. As was just mentioned by Roberta, this is such an important group that you're leading community conversations beyond the public meetings and, you know, critiquing this process and the details of what's being proposed along the way. This is the ultimate in public service, that you would give your time and volunteer to help the community through this, what is always a very challenging process, which can be emotional and there's so many opinions related to. So thank you so much. And it's been mentioned a couple times already in the 30 minutes you've been on this call. I was a few minutes late, but have heard several compliment the staff, and I want to do that myself. Arriving here just last Wednesday, I've been so impressed by, number one, the commitment to everyone that I've met in the planning department to this city, to Boise, the genuine concern they have about this community. And like yourself, you know, I mean, these are residents of the city that have deep feelings about doing the best they can for you and for everybody that lives in this city. So Andrea, Deanna, Lena in particular, and Lindsay, and I feel a big obligation to do what I can to put them in the best position to be successful. So I want to acknowledge what a talented group of people, and talented in addition to dedicated to the city. And just my last thing is really just, and Esther was speaking to this, and I've had a few people, including last night at the public meeting we had, ask me, you know, why are you here? I'm coming from the southeastern United States, of course, and I'll tell you that the reason that I thought this was a place I'm interested in living and helping is for the reasons that you're discussing. You know, the fact that this is, number one, a community that recognizes the relationship between the physical place and the prosperity of the people. I've been in a city for 7 years that didn't recognize that. So I was excited to be in a place again that does, and that is such a distinctive city. Both the people part of the city, the more urban part of the city, and nature, and what that relationship is, and how each is so distinctive. And at this time, in the sense that the city is growing in ways that maybe it hasn't before, and that's generating great concern, legitimate concerns about how it's changing the city. And that's this conversation you're having, and the struggle you're in the midst of, related to how to organize your regulations such that they're producing the best that they can, is substantially why I decided to come to Boise. And I say that just to say these are really, really, even last night and much of the discussion, some of which was related to the technical aspects of what was being presented, but much of it was also not. It was more just about how the city's changing, how it's growing. And when you're dealing with things like housing affordability and affordability in general, and mobility and conservation, these are things that cities really struggle with. And I had a sense in my decision to come here and work with you that perhaps Boise could do this better than any other city. And that's certainly what I'm interested in, because of that concern that you have for the place and understanding of the place as it relates to solving these problems. Because you can't not deal with the place if you're going to deal with affordability and mobility and conservation. And I will say, my expectation is that we're not looking at sharing the burden across the city, or we're not looking at balancing things. We're looking at what's the optimal condition for Boise. What is the best city that Boise can become in terms of the community's aspirations, and taking into account those things that so affect who can live here, and what your quality of life is like as it relates to things like getting around the city and having varieties of options for where you live and jobs and things like this, and that we're seeking the best solutions and the best outcomes, not balancing things or sharing burdens. So Andrea, thanks for giving me a few minutes, and I look forward to meeting everybody in person, those I haven't yet, and have loved meeting those that I have, and look forward to continuing to work with you on this, and taking your suggestions and doing what we must in order to achieve the best of this process.
Thank you, Tim. It's been a pleasure. And as we move forward, we're going to do a little deep dive into Module 3 content. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our Clarion team. So that'll be Dawn and Gabby.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Tim. I had a chance to speak with Tim briefly last week, and I'm glad he's there. I'm glad he had time to share your thoughts and your approach, your value system with us a little bit today. So everybody take a deep breath. I guess what I would say as we start into this is two things. As many of you remember, when the mayor was elected, she reconstituted this group, and she deliberately put on it people with, I think, significantly divergent opinions about what would make Boise the best city, as Tim says. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That is what we're experiencing, the difficulty of some of these meetings, the difficulty of the strong emotions one way or the other, is just, it's just reflective of the fact that it's a diverse group, and it is to the city's credit that it's not afraid of having a diverse group like this. Some of your comments about the Planning Commission and City Council kind of suggest that you wish there were more diversity of opinion on those groups. And so we have it here. So let's just keep working with it. It is an advantage. It's not a disadvantage. It is likely to result in more thoughtful outcomes and things that are more likely to lead us to the best Boise. So second thing I'd say is let's take a breath. I think everybody that I have talked to in attending some of the neighborhood meetings and in seeing the email communications that happen and talking to staff about these meetings is people really want to understand modules 1 and 2. And all of us have said all the way along the line, they are not done until they're done. And they're always drafts. They're always available for modification. And we need to make sure that we are listening to those things. And the comments of too much of this and too little of that is, it's, you know, we've said it so many, many times, and we mean it. Those things are all in play until you get to near the end of this process. And we're not near the end of this process. And so I know staff's doing the outreach to increase that understanding, and I'm confident it'll be successful. But let's take a breath, because part of what will make Boise the best city is what we've put out in module 1 and 2. What can you do on your property? How big can it be? Will it shadow the neighbors? Is there enough parking? Is there too much parking? Is there landscaping? Is there buffering? All of that is part of what makes Boise a great city. But I'm asking you to shift gears today. In the next couple of months, we need to start talking about the issues of how the city does business, how it could do business in a better way. And I'll just say it, one that would create more confidence and less distrust of the city. We've had that distrust word said a number of times in this process. But we have heard a number of things, and I'll put a slide up and we'll just go through the presentation and then open it up for some questions halfway through and then at the end. But we have heard that, and we heard it today. We've just heard 20 minutes of it, 25 minutes of the distrust and the disconnection between what people want the city to be and how they want it to interact with citizens and builders, and what they perceive as the way it is right now. So that's module 3 stuff. It's important. It's not getting ahead of the cart ahead of the horse. It is tackling the third kind of leg of the stool, which is that how the city engages people, treats people, listens to people, responds to people, engages people is a big part of what makes a great city and what makes a happy city and a not distrustful city. So let's go into this, and I'm going to do the first half of this presentation, and then Gabby's going to do the second part. So let's get back to the diagnostic report. It's 2 years ago. We've been focused mostly on uses and forms and dimensions and heights, but this is what we heard in the diagnostic round of this. There's a perceived lack of predictability and consistency throughout the various and overlapping review processes. There was confusion and misinformation about what neighborhood meetings are and what they aren't, and how they can or how they can't influence the process. A need for a more transparent, efficient, and objective review process, and a need to refine the design review process and clarify the responsibilities of the design review committee. Now, we heard that. I think we heard some of that reflected a little bit today too. I have said before, and I'll say again, we have heard fewer comments about design review committee and design review process, fewer negative questions or comments than we did 2 years ago. So that has changed. The personnel have changed, and I just want to acknowledge this is what we put in the diagnostic. This is what we had heard. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen. The code is where you talk about how neighborhood meetings happen, how they operate, and how design review happens and how it operates. So we're going back to what did we hear? On the right-hand side now, you can look at our recommendations. Strengthen the general decision-making criteria to increase clarity and transparency, and simplify and standardize the waiver and adjustment provisions to limit the number of variance requests and increase predictability. I have said it before, and I'll say it again. Predictability of outcomes is one of the big favors you can do to build trust in local government, and trust that the code will in fact implement the plan and take you where you want to go. We, Gabby and I, but me in particular, for a long time have done this. It undermines confidence in local government when people can't be fairly sure of what the outcomes are going to be in a particular situation. Writing the code with clear criteria as to what will be the basis of approving or conditioning or denying a project just makes it much easier for the citizens and the developers and the neighbors and prospective property owners to understand what's likely to happen. The more that happens, the more you build trust. And so again, we've got, you can go see on the left-hand side, this is an example of what you have. You have some things that are words. They are typical words, but they leave a lot of room for different outcomes. And frankly, I often hear in communities, I won't put this in Boise's mouth, the same people who are at the same time, you sometimes hear comes from citizens, they're disappointed because it seems like for every rule, there's an exception. You'll hear from developers that for every rule, there's a way to deny the project. And so it is not a one-sided thing. Predictability is part of good governance. It doesn't mean the rule has to be X, but the rule ought to be clear enough that if it's not X, it might be Y, and under the following circumstances, it could be Z, but say that. It's not a matter of just how people are feeling on a given night and who happened to show up as part of the quorum of the decision-making group. So that's what we heard. We're just going to go through some basic things in the first half about the roles of the different decision makers. So staff, you guys, we sometimes call it staff in a code, and when we're writing this, or staff, but the point is there are administrative applications. A sign permit usually is just a decision for staff. If it's not too tall, it's not too high, it's not too close, it's not too brightly lit, it gets approved because the rules are in the code. I'm giving that as an example. If it's huge, it might go to a hearing, but lots of things are just staff. Does it have enough parking or not is often a staff ratio if you're redoing a property in a new way. Hearing examiner question mark. The city has been discussing, and it has this in writing, it doesn't have it staffed. Should there be a hearing examiner for future use for minor applications that require a hearing? You don't want to just have the director do it. You want people to be able to comment on whether it meets these criteria or not. And you give that decision to a hearing examiner. The question mark is the city hasn't decided whether it wants one or not, but we're putting it on the table because they are thinking about it. It's a way to give minor or technical things to someone who is trained to listen to the testimony, listen to sometimes technical, geological or engineering or hillside reasons and say, all right, I think it or floodplain, and say it meets it or doesn't meet it, with a right of appeal, but basically a hearing with something that is not in front of a larger group. Design review committee, you are well aware of, we've talked about it. Their general role is aesthetics of a project subject to design review. Basically in Boise, it's a little bit of an overstatement, but not much, to say that all multifamily, commercial, and industrial projects are subject to design review. There's the Historic Preservation Commission, you understand their role. There's the Planning and Zoning Commission, which is a very important body in this system, because they make recommendations to City Council on major applications, rezonings, etc. So again, design review usually has a limited ambit. It's pretty broad in Boise. Historic Preservation has a limited ambit. Planning Commission is a lot broader ambit for an appointed group. And then of course, City Council for final legislative authority and, adopting the code or adopting a zoning change. Now, appeals body has a question mark too. Some cities, in addition to this list, would have a separate board of adjustment that is there to hear appeals. It is there to, frankly, not have appeals go up to City Council or elected or appointed or elected or a planning commission. And in those cities, and it is many of them, who have a separate appeals board, they don't ask the Planning and Zoning Commission to hear appeals. They have a separate group, and its focus is not, will this decision implement our plans? That's Planning and Zoning Commission's decision. It is, did somebody make a mistake in applying our code? We put a question mark after it because this is a question for the city to consider as it thinks through how it wants to do business in the future. Maybe some of you will have comments on that in the future. Boise, I think Boise, in my mind, I will say, for a medium-sized city, most of them have a separate hearing board. Most of them do not have planning and zoning making those decisions. It does not mean it's wrong at all. It's just, it is, if I had to count noses around the country in medium and large sized cities, I would say above a certain size, most of them, more than half of them have an appeals board of some kind. So let's just talk about roles. Those are the groups. And most cities try to run themselves so that they clearly define in the procedures what will be decided at an administrative level. And they implement it. They decide these decisions. For those who are not geeks about zoning, when you get public hearings, there are two different kinds of public hearings that go out there, and they have legal consequences. Quasi-judicial decisions are the rezoning of a particular piece of property or a variance. They require discretion to determine whether they're consistent with the comp plan or with the standards in the code. And basically, most of what planning and zoning does, design review does, historic preservation does, or that a hearing examiner or appeals board would do is doing this. We're trying to evaluate, does this site-specific application, conditional use on a particular site, variance on a particular site, rezoning of a particular piece of land, does it meet the criteria for making that decision as put forward in the code? And the third one is legislative decisions, and that's only city council. And in certain cases, for example, the adoption of the new zoning ordinance when that comes forward, or the adoption of a conversion zoning map are usually legislative decisions. They are setting up a new system of rules for the entire city. They are not applying it to my property or your property or this neighborhood or that neighborhood. It's a big piece of land or it's a citywide issue. And the reason they're different is that in legislative decisions, it's much more likely the city council be deciding based on the overall good of the entire population. And there's frankly a lot less due process due. That's why you elect them, so they can use their judgment as to direction setting and rulemaking for the entire city. In a quasi-judicial decision, there's actually more due process required in many cases because the courts and the state are worried about the being unfair to a particular owner in a particular place. If it's quasi-judicial and it's Don Elliott's property, there's a possibility that people have it in for Don Elliott, or they like Don Elliott, or they don't like people like Don Elliott. And so actually, when you have quasi-judicial decisions, there's often a good bit of due process because you want to make sure it's being made fairly based on the code as applied to this situation and taking into account the fact people may be exercising their own biases, and you don't want that to happen. So there's a little bit more due process to allow questioning and creating a record so that you know exactly why this decision was made. Sometimes city councils don't have to create nearly as detailed a record as to why they do legislative decisions. It was a public hearing. You heard the discussion. They decided they wanted to go in this direction. So those are the basic backgrounds. I wanted to talk a little bit about how Boise does public hearings, because that's been a topic. The way the city is set up, their public hearings take place at different regular times each month for different decision-making bodies. You submit written testimony by the Thursday prior to the meeting. You can sign up in advance or at the meetings, and they're all held at a time. And the image on the right side is simply, these are the time frames. This is the calendar of when you have public hearings and when you have to submit things in order to have it considered for the public hearing. This is pretty standard, but it is a process by which you set people up for success. You can't just walk in and drop a document in that nobody's had a chance to look at, and that someone who might agree with you would say, well, I didn't even know that was out there. I didn't have a chance to look at that. And so there are deadlines and there's a schedule. So I want to just set these out, and we're going to go to a question pretty quickly on this and take a break. Right now, you have a lot of conditional uses, a broader number of not just uses, but other things, other decisions in Boise that require a conditional use permit approval. Our initial reaction when Clarion looks at the code is those are not conditional uses. There are other things that other cities don't say go through a conditional use process. You use it a lot, but and that's not wrong. It'll be right when the city council says it's right. But the point is, you have a lot of these, fair amount, good number. And what if it's in a historic area? You could require a hearing before both of these groups, the PCC and the HPC. What if it's a conditional use subject to design review? That's two kind of public hearings and review and approvals. Major subdivisions. You sometimes have a system where you're reviewing the basic layout of a subdivision plat at both Planning Commission and for approval, having it at City Council. And then the last one is simply this, that it appears to us, and once again, your procedures are pretty complicated as we've gotten into trying to understand them, and not entirely clear how it works. So if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But you do appear to have numerous opportunities for appeal of individual decisions. So you have a decision that requires design review and, heaven forfend, design review, a conditional use permit, and it's in a historic area. That individually, those decisions can be appealed along the way. There are cities out there that try to combine the appeals so you don't have multiple appeals, and you say, if we're going to have people who think the code has not been applied properly, we're going to have fewer of those, or we're going to consolidate them into one, so that yes, it's a valid question. Did somebody misapply this? But that's not necessarily a reason to have multiple hearings about why different branches of the city decision-making process may have misapplied different parts of the code. So that's one of the things that we have been struggling with, because when we hear, it's unpredictable. Some of the stories we heard were, I wasn't sure how the CUP process was going to work, and I was a little surprised at the outcome. And then I was wasn't sure how design review would come, but I disagree with that outcome. I didn't like the decision that was made. I'm just picking on those as examples. And that each one of these, to the degree there's uncertainty, it's kind of compounded when you have multiple public hearings. I lost this time around. I thought maybe I'd win the next time around. I lost that time too. And so we want to throw it out to the group, whether there is opportunity to try to better describe the way in which these review and decision-making bodies relate to each other. So, as I have hinted in the comments so far, as we get into thinking about how the city does business, these are some questions. In general, when we are asked to work with cities to rewrite codes, we are asked, are there opportunities for us to consolidate public hearings so that more aspects of a decision could be considered in a single public hearing rather than having multiple public hearings? Sometimes you could have a consolidated hearing in which a group, I'm making this example up, I'm just completely making this example up, but it's an example where if you're going to have two public hearings on a conditional use permit and a design review, you do them in one hearing, and you say, for purposes of the conditional use, we're applying these criteria. In connection with the design review committee, we're applying these criteria, but we're not going to go around twice here. And there are times, I've actually seen times where people have joint meetings. They have the design review and planning commission have it together, so they have that decision together rather than sequentially. And then appeals. Are there chances to consolidate appeals? Once again, when you have an appeal, most cities strive to have fewer appeals. Appeals mean somebody really was disappointed in this and they think it wasn't done properly. You want to have as few of those situations as possible. And if you can consolidate them so that you create the impression, look, this is a pretty clear and transparent set of criteria. If there's a mistake, we'll consider it. But some communities are trying to consolidate those. So I do want to talk about one more thing. You do have this table. This is the top line of a table in your current ordinance. Basically, it's reformatted, but to talk about who makes which kinds of decisions, what kind of neighborhood meetings are needed, and what kind of notice is needed, and then where would you go to get more information. Adding more detail to that is a way of being transparent and being clearer, even if there are exceptions that have to be footnoted. And then the other trend that is happening again in a number of cities, I would say some cities are getting rid of hearing examiners, others are adding them. When they add them, they're often adding them for things that are fairly technical. A floodplain variance has to do with its risk of creating a flood, not whether people like it or not. A river system permit has to do with its probable effect on the environment. A hillside development permit has to do with erosion as well as the aesthetics. And so often when hearing examiners are created, it is because you want somebody who can keep focused on the technical public health, safety, welfare, environmental values rather than planning and general future of the city values. So today, I just want to go there. Design review procedures today. I'm going on because we're going to put 2 questions out. One about the relationship of different groups and one about design review. It's basically required for all multifamily commercial office and industrial development. Meaning, and what do we mean by that? Well, you can see in modules 1 and 2 what we classify in those things. There's a flow chart on the right as to how you do it now. And again, it is a separate procedure right now. And you do have a system of minor design review, which is approved at the staff level, and major that goes up to the DRC. Just for those of you who haven't been through the process, that's your process today. So I've shifted in the last slide to say, we talked about general relationships. Now we're talking about design review. In many cities and in the version of module 2 that is out there for discussion right now, we have made some changes. We have put into the code some objective design standards, some things that are just objective. They are close to the street, far from the street, location of things, doors and windows on the street. And this 3-step process is, we're trying to kind of communicate, how are other cities thinking about this? Increasingly, there are things which are just reviewed because there's design standards in the code, just like the number of parking spaces. It either isn't adequate or it's not adequate. There's adjustments, either you get an adjustment or you don't get an adjustment, but these are objective design standards approved for broad categories, just period. That's a trend. Some communities keep that and also have a minor design review procedure, meaning we put in black and white what we thought we could decide today about these different things. But there is a different process at staff level where you have to put people through a more discretionary process, where you basically say, we think staff can decide it, but it does involve some discretion. However, these decisions are not often appealed. Nobody seems unhappy with them. And so it's a different list. Instead of just black and white, it is some criteria on which to approve a somewhat discretionary design review, and then let it be appealed if the applicant doesn't like it or the neighbors don't like it, appeal up to the design review body. Why? Because there is some discretion involved. Well, Don, I thought you said discretion went to the design review group. Yes, most of it does, but a number of cities delegate minor things down to save time because in their experience, not many people appeal these decisions. They are routinely approved and the development community gets used to them and predicts the outcome. And so there you go. The question mark is, do we need minor design review and also objective design standards? They could be one thing. Some cities don't have minor. They say if it's objective, staff decides it. If it's got discretion, it goes up to the hearing. We did put a bullet under minor that in trends are to say, if it's going to go through minor, and it's part of a CUP, you probably send it up to CUP and let them decide it, whether it meets the minor standards. Some don't, some keep it separate, but some say, look, these are minor decisions. Our staff report tells you that we would approve this based on minor design. We think it meets the design review, but we're sending it up to planning and zoning because they need to decide the fundamental issue. We don't really expect them to question our judgment on the design, but they could. And then major design review, which you're used to, which is often appealable to a governing body. So I put the middle as a question. Sometimes there's a 3-tiered system. Sometimes it's only 2 tiers. And if you had to guess, okay, Don, we want to go 1 or 2, I would say the trend is most places go to 1 and say, look, let's try to be objective at design standards. And if it's got to go somewhere, it just goes up to historic preservation or design review committee. So these are the 2 questions in the first half. What types of decisions should go before City Council, Planning Commission, Design Review? I would be particularly interested with anybody who says, I think these should go up or these shouldn't go up. And then, are there opportunities to consolidate? You have a separate system for design review. We completely understand the logic of that, but it does add time and it does add some level of uncertainty. So, Andrea?
Yes, so as we kick this off, we had a couple of questions that had come in, and it was specifically, when appeals happen, is when we have an appeals board as a possibility, are the appeal boards elected or appointed? And then, Dawn, do you have any specific example of a city size or a threshold where appeals boards are typically used?
The short answer is that hearing examiners are usually appointed under a contract with the city. The city, just like it asked for a zoning consultant, says, we're interested in hiring somebody on a part-time basis with knowledge about our code and about, sometimes it's a lawyer, usually it's a lawyer, somebody who understands how to create a legal record, and they take procurement and then they take the most qualified candidate and put them on a contract for a year. That's what usually it is. In bigger cities, it's sometimes a salaried position if they have a large number of these things. I don't have a number, but I would be happy, Andrea, to send you examples of cities that do use a hearing board and their populations. So you could circulate it to the group and say, do we think we're more like this or not? There isn't a threshold. People do it very differently. I'll stick with what I said earlier. Usually about the time when you're the size of Boise, it's more common to see a separate appeals board, but I'll send you examples. Okay, and so you kind of went back and forth. You spoke a little bit about hearings examiner and a little bit about appeals board. Do cities of our size typically have both? I've already said, I think cities your size often have an appeals board separate from the planning board. I would not make that same statement about hearing examiner. I would say it is probably, I would actually say a minority of cities have a hearing examiner. Usually the threshold for when you put somebody on salary or a contract for appeals is a little higher. So I know of a number of cities that have a board of adjustment and don't have a hearing examiner. Nope, that's great. And I think that leads us really nicely into some of these questions. So really talking about what items do you think are reasonable to, be reviewed by our different bodies, and are there opportunities to maybe consolidate those or to do them a little bit differently than what we have? So we'll open it up for any comments or thoughts, recommendations. Ian, you want to go first, and then we'll hear from Shellen.
Sure. Yeah, hopefully it's not too loud in my office today. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
Cool. So I do appreciate that currently some projects, I think it's multifamily projects in a certain zone are required to go through design review. I think that kind of holds a certain scale and type of project accountable and make, accountable to design review standards and all that. So I think there are projects that definitely need to be looked at. Smaller scale, I don't know that it's as critical. I guess just throwing this out there to the point of having a multi-tiered system like minor design review versus major design review, that just starts seeing a little convoluted for me. If I'm a designer, I don't know which one I'm ultimately going to have to go to, and then it's just going to kind of add time to that process. That's my limited experience though. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. How about Shellen?
Thanks. I have so much on this. I think one thing I just want to say as a statement that we haven't talked about, and I want to understand if maybe it's worth diving into for another time or not. There is something that I feel is very unique in Boise, and that is when you go to a meeting, a lot of those items will be moved to consent at the time of the meeting, depending on whether or not there is somebody present and now virtual that has a comment. And I think that is a really poor way of doing things for a handful of reasons. I think it's really inefficient. I think I don't think it benefits community members, developers, or the board that you're seeing. So I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on that to the consultant team, or if that's addressed. Maybe it's state law. I don't know. Item number one. The idea of consolidating design review and planning commission for certain larger scale projects, I think makes a lot of sense. In my experience, when I have to go to planning commission, it is a true entitlement. And we spend a lot of time and a lot of money making sure that we are able to meet that entitlement. And by the time we go to design, which can be appealed, and by the time we go to design review, there really is not much that they are able to have any meaningful, it's a false sense to the community and provides uncertainty to the community that there's really much the design review board can do when you're talking about larger projects. And so I think it gives people a very false sense of the power that they do or don't have by having those 2 meetings, two public hearings, 2 appeal process. Just as the other day, a woman came up to me and said, how come there weren't more people here at this design review meeting? It's like, because it doesn't matter. It is entitled. The site is entitled already. So I think I think that is something that should be cleaned up. And the types of decisions that should go to council, planning commission, or design review, I don't understand really why land use goes to council much. I think that non-political body would make a lot of sense. And I think it should be viewed with the lens of the legalities of the code. I mean, the code is a legal document. And if I was on council, which hopefully I never will be, but like, I would want to know, am I going to get sued for voting one way or the other, right? Like, it should be somebody that understands land use law saying whether or not this appeal is accurate. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then lastly, I just like, this is anecdotally, and some other people on this call know a lot more about this, or know about this project, but I had a multifamily project in R3 zoning that had to get a CUP that was then called a PUD. It got administrative DR, but we had to go through a public hearing for doing multifamily on multifamily. And to me, that's not a conditional use. Like, if I'm doing multifamily on a piece of property that's zoned multifamily, it's giving the community a false sense of power as to what they can argue or not. So I don't know how to like say that in a concise way or create a code, but the certainty is critical to creating trust. And you said that a million times, Dawn, but I just am reiterating it.
Let me answer one part if I can, Andrea. I see we have other hands up and we'll get to them. But I wanted to answer the very first question that Shellen mentioned. I think there is a trend. There is certainly a trend in the communities that I am aware of and where codes have been rewritten in the last 10 years to try to say it is a better practice to, if you think it's an administrative decision or if it's the kind of thing that usually goes on consent agenda, make it administrative, give notice of the decision, and let them appeal it, because making people notice things to go to a hearing when it's then going to be put on the consent agenda, it's time. It's not a lot of time. It's a lot of time, but frankly, a lot of mistakes are made sometimes in noticing, and it opens up another source of uncertainty, is that you've gone through the noticing process to get to a hearing with the fair knowledge that you're not going to have the hearing, because 9 times out of 10, those are put on the consent agenda. So in general, as people, I said this before to guys, the answer will be right when Boise says it's right. There isn't a right answer, but I don't have any clients ever who have said, I'd like this process to take longer and have more steps in it. And so that is one of the ways in which people have tried to remove steps, is if it's very likely that this is an administrative judgment that will go on consent agenda, let's make it an administrative judgment subject to appeal.
That's great. And Shellen kind of led the way that, saying that it potentially could be easier for a developer to have some combined hearings. And in the chat, Kelly has noted that combining hearings could also make it easier for the public to participate as well. So that's an interesting dynamic, both of those. I do want to hear from Richard, then Byron, and then Jessica.
Yes. Thank you. A quick, just minor point, but a detail. Sometimes, from my observation, the agenda for a meeting isn't up until after the due date for public comments. So that's a problem when it happens. And I don't understand when it happens exactly. It seems kind of random. In terms of combining meetings or what should be separate, and I think this is probably across the board, people get upset by it, because I've certainly seen comments from both neighborhoods and applicants. When we have a situation where you have a rezone and, for example, a decision by city council, which the primary decision is like a rezone, and also at the same time, an appeal of a earlier decision, say a PUD, in which the Planning and Zoning Commission makes the final decision. So when we combine, our practice now is to combine those into one hearing. And it becomes very confusing because, of course, on an appeal, we don't hear new evidence, et cetera. It's and the rezone is related, and these things interact. But yeah, it just becomes, I think, from a legal point of view, as well as just a process point of view, people are left not understanding how they can participate and remain in bounds within that particular hearing, because a lot of times they're not really even separated in any way internally as well. And then finally, it's not something I know much about and haven't thought much about, but I've been surprised at how important the exterior of especially larger buildings is. And I've been impressed with our system of design review, actually. I think in part, maybe because they tend to be commissioned by professionals. And I think they're people, I think, experienced with the ways that applicants might be trying to get around the rules. And those have implications, not just for this short-term aesthetics, but, long-term durability or how well something functions. So I've been, it's true, we don't go to design review very often in my neighborhood, but when we do, especially because we're not in a historic district, that really does help to have that. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you. Byron, you want to take her away?
Yeah, thank you. Quick question for Don. So are we talking about, is it on the table that we're talking about design review and planning commission being combined into one commission, or just maintaining two separate commissions and then sharing meetings, sharing public hearings from time to time?
I think everything is on the table. There are three different, I was not actually suggesting getting rid of the design review committee. I was suggesting that some cities say, if we can tell this is going to go for both a CUP and design, the design review committee delegates to planning and zoning to make a decision subject to the same things, same standards they would have to apply in that situation. Now,
okay,
the usual answer is, well, but the design review committee is architects and the planning and zoning are not trained in design. So, but I was not suggesting that the committee be dismantled or merged. You could do that, but I was suggesting that there may be times where you either do a joint meeting or one group delegates to the other the ability to make a joint decision on two sets of criteria.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the clarification. To Shellen's point, I guess, about the phasing for a typical large project, a multifamily project, let's say, internally, having to rely on, and I am in support of some degree of consolidation. I think anytime we can consolidate public hearings right off the bat, we're still kind of chasing this carrot of affordability, right? For any kind of project that has any chance of being, of achieving affordability for specifically housing products. Anytime we can cut one public hearing out of the entitlement process or permitting process, that's thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of the project. So, and that's just architectural engineering fees, some legal fees. So anytime we can do that, that makes sense. We should shoot for that. If we're also looking at this long-term goal of predictability, it seems like chasing predictability would allow for some of that to happen without the community losing some sense of some role in public comment too, because I want to be wary of taking away that control piece. And I guess the overall goal would be to try to find efficiencies there, right? give everybody kind of what they need, but also kind of cut the fat from the process, the unnecessary parts of the process. So I'm in favor of that. But there's another part that Shellen spoke to about the entitlement process. So much of a project in the early stages really is trying to find that form, if not the very specific design elements, but definitely the form. And architects are usually in this kind of holding pattern or kept in limbo during the planning process, whereby we don't have this solid ground, so to speak, to design from. If we don't know that the land entitlements aren't going to go through in a particular way, we can't really design ahead. There's so much unintentional looping that happens where architects have to go back to the drawing board, so to speak, because something didn't happen correctly in the entitlements process. So if we are speaking about predictability, it seems to me like that is our guiding light for finding that efficiency between those two commissions. That if we have that degree of predictability, that can serve the design process well, and it can also kind of possibly trim one or two additional approval processes that, like Shellen said, are just without legs as you go further through the process. I hope that made sense, but I'm kind of thinking live here.
That's why we're here. That's fine. It's good.
That's great. How about Jessica, who is from Design Review? So this will be a great perspective.
Yeah, I'm on Design Review here in Boise on the committee. And also my professional job, I'm in charge of entitlements for the company that I work with. And all of my projects are in California and Washington and in Keene County. So for any of the folks who've had experience in those jurisdictions, Boise's pretty easy in comparison. So I'll just start with that. As a member of DR, I think it's important to keep two separate meetings and public hearings. You have obviously your planning portion, which really it's all about land use. Is it the right use at the right location? How does it impact the adjacent property, neighborhoods, etc.? I think that's a really important conversation and just discussion by itself. And then I think DR on its own, in terms of the aesthetic, I think that's a really good, important, separate conversation as well. What I would be concerned about if they were combined, there's a couple things just from a practical standpoint. Those meetings would go on until 2 in the morning on some cases. And that would not be fun. And I think that would discourage volunteers like myself and others who participate on those committees. And I think at some point down the road, it would discourage the public because who wants to go to number 5 on the agenda, and each agenda item is going to take 3 hours or 2 hours. So I think that's something to think about. I don't think that happens all the time, but P&Z meetings are much longer than DR meetings. The other thing is at DR, we look at a lot of details that I think for most folks, they don't consider or think about. And it's not necessarily publicly said in those meetings, but as my fellow commission members, we kind of know what each other's hot spots are and what we're going to pick on. And Shellen was at our meeting last week, and she brought in a great project, and she knows how the system works and what to do. And there wasn't really a lot of question with her project. I thought that was a very successful, really good outcome. But we have others who don't always bring in great projects like Shellen did. And there's a lot of little details, simple little details. Like my pet peeve for your architects and engineers here is rooftop units. And a lot of times they come in, they're not screened. A lot of the apartment buildings like downtown, they want to do like PTAC units, and what those are the units that are like in the wall of your apartment. Like you might see it if you go in a hotel and you see those units in your hotel room, they like to do that. And that really impacts the exterior of the building. So those are like things, little minor things, or to me, they're not minor, but things that we're looking at that level of detail. And I don't think in general, and it's globally known that those are some of the items that we're looking at, and we're trying to discourage in a lot of our buildings downtown. Consent agenda. I don't mind consent agenda. Our staff reports that we get are 50 pages plus. If you saw all the work that staff does in doing their review and comments, and if you saw Andrea's staff reports back when she was doing design review back in the day, a ton of hours, a ton of detail. They do their homework. If they say it's good, I'm good with it as well, because that's just the level and quality of staff that we have at Boise City. And unfortunately, in this economy, in these times, we've lost a lot of key people, great people. And so that's something that's going to change a little bit. So A, I want 2 meetings. B, I support consent agenda. And Shellen, you had a great project. Thank you. And I know Andy's going to chime in too. I want to hear what he has to say. Thanks.
Yeah, have at it, Andy. Oh, you're on mute.
Jessica, thanks for being on DR. Having sat on DR for 12 and a half years in the 90s and early turn of the century, DR used to take up all the signs as well. So 2 a.m. meetings were nothing. That was just standard course. I think we talked a little bit about a hearings examiner, and the hearings examiner did save DR from complete implosion and everyone leaving the world, right? So I think the city has, and I think, Don, you and your team are smart to bring that component up for discussion, because I think the hearing examiner can take so much minutia off the plates of the work that needs to really have the scrutiny of professionals, whether they're design professionals or engineering professionals. I will also chime in. I do not, to be honest, see the value or the logic of combining design review with planning and zoning for a couple of reasons. And I think what has to happen if that is some direction we want to go, is we have to feed back into the ordinance, the zoning ordinance, and define what constitutes a reason for a public hearing and what doesn't constitute it, and why you have why you're combining 2 different entitlements, 2 different boxes that you have to check that are both different. We have Jessica, thanks for the recognition that we have it pretty doggone well here in Boise, Idaho, when it comes to pursuing entitlements. We do work all over the Western US, and 12 to 14 weeks just to get on a docket before it's even reviewed is nothing. And so our clients are sitting out there with capital, with money, looking for entitlements, and still having a degree of uncertainty. And that's one of the comments we've had repeatedly in today's discussion. How do we eliminate uncertainty? And I think there will always be some risk and there will always be some certainty, but as we rewrite the zoning ordinances, I don't want to throw the processes out that guarantee neighbors, community members, and clients, or neighbors, community members, and owners and developers due process. And so the city uses the consent agenda as an affirmation of that due process, because you can, if you don't agree with the city's report on a project, you can go back in and ask for it to be heard and publicly discussed. And And if you agree with it, or you don't have anything wrong with it, then the consent agenda allows it. At least everyone has an opportunity then to look at the design review process. Planning and zoning has a similar process. I have yet to see a consent agenda. Well, no, that's not true. I've had a consent agenda in planning and zoning, but it was so long ago, most of you weren't probably born. So, you know, I think we have to protect the process that ensures neighbors and the community. You know, we've been talking a lot about trust, that the community does have an opportunity to comment on the direction of development in the valley once this zoning ordinance becomes law. So.
Thank you, Andy. And how about Hillary?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks. I also sat on design review briefly, and I don't necessarily have a problem with the consent agenda itself. I think that, you know, what Andy raised is valid, but it was very astonishing to me just how much design review heard and how many items went to consent agenda. And I think, you know, from a legal perspective, that begs the question as to whether you actually need that beefy of an agenda and whether DR should apply to as many things as it does. I think that DR does have a place. I do think it is different than what planning and zoning might be looking at. It's, you know, primarily focused on aesthetics, interaction with the streetscape, neighboring buildings, that kind of stuff. I think it is difficult right now, the way that the design review code is written. There is a lot in the design review code and standards that will likely be folded into what we're discussing right now. So I think that to some degree, that's going to already take a bunch of stuff like massing off of design review's plate. So there may be less that they hear just because some of that substance has been shifted into code. I also just don't think that we need to have design review guidelines that apply to every single project in the city. I think that the critical items for design review are, you know, areas that we've labeled as gateway areas, high profile projects, large public projects, very large scale projects, and potentially, though I know I'm going to get a lot of blowback on this from some of the developers, but potentially where you have projects that are approved by right that do not need to go through a public hearing process, design review may make some sense for purely aesthetic values. But I think that it is important to separate the two. I do think it's okay if design comes after some of the bigger entitlements, but I would like to see design review scope, you know, limited to those higher profile projects. It would make it more interesting for design review too.
And then how about Byron?
Just a quick follow-up question, listening to everyone's discussion here. A question for Andrea and other staff. Is there a way to pull the consent agenda items backward in time far enough prior to a hearing to be able to know which projects can be consolidated? That's a kind of a tricky question, and I know that there are reasons for that happening sometimes at the very last minute, but I'm wondering if a different process combined with a slightly different process combined with the predictability that we're after with the new code may provide an opportunity for some of those items that normally would be consent agenda items that are not likely to be contested because they're very close to by right, or they've checked every single box in the code. Projects like that that are likely not to be contested to have the opportunity to be consolidated into a single hearing. I don't know, that's a mechanics question, I guess, but.
Well, when we talk about once a development application is submitted, we have this pretty intense process that happens immediately. So we transmit to all of our agencies and let them know when their comments are due, because they do have a different schedule if it's a administrative level approval versus a commission or public hearing level. And then we also have to publish anything that goes to public hearing. So really the process that we have now, we have to know which avenue that goes very early on, ultimately, when that project is submitted. So there isn't a way where you can almost regress and then, start down a different path if everything's looking positive. So it's a little bit unfortunate. But once you head down a path, you're almost fully committed to that. So,
yeah, I guess the other question that comes to mind really is, we have some discrete applications right now for projects that are fairly common. And I'm thinking of, let's say, and this is a very small scale type of project, but an ADU in a historic preservation district. Projects like that depending on where they are in which district, how close they are to, say, the foothills, a project like that can sometimes require 5 different applications and approvals. In a worst case scenario, the worst spot in Boise to build an ADU, five permits, right? So I'm wondering if some projects that are commonplace enough, multifamily, fourplexes, there's probably a host of other projects, mixed use projects too, that are common enough whose application material or applications could be consolidated into one based on project type, I guess is what I'm thinking.
You may be able to do that. You also, as things move forward, a lot of times you'll see a conditional use permit that has a variance attached to it, and we are able to review those consecutively and concurrently. So, that is a possibility too, that you could look at, reviewing things as one package. Unless, of course, there is that design review component, because as we've heard, there's a lot of important pieces and details and knowledge that, typically doesn't always, follow suit with just entitlements or legalities that go with that. So, yeah, there's so much to consider. Yeah, Shellen, you've got your hand up.
Well, I just wanted to clarify on the consent agenda. I think where I struggle with it is I think there's a great place for consent, and it is for what is hard about the way we do consent, I think, in this community is that the public can pull off consent. It doesn't require the board or the commission to pull off consent. And I think that gives the public a false sense. Yes, they can pull it off to have a public discussion, but if staff has approved it, to Jessica's point, if you've got competent staff, if you've got a decent code, staff has recommended it, and it recommended it to be on consent, there is nothing to argue about, right? In theory, I'm saying, like, if everyone's doing their job right, there should be nothing to argue about, and to give the public the right to pull it off consent gives them a false sense of what that commission is able to review. So consent is great. I just think the idea that the public can pull it off. Now, if one of the board members sees something on consent that is questionable, or maybe this is too big of a project to be on consent, or I heard from my constituents that this is a really upsetting project, board members should be able to pull off consent anytime. That's where I was going with that. I just didn't know if people understood that. And then I think it was Hillary that made the point, I'm a developer. I'm all for going to design review, even if I have a by right entitlement, because it forces me and my design team to do the right thing. So I don't think that is a big hiccup. As long as you know the entitlement and you know the form, then you have your capital and you can start moving forward. So I think from that perspective, like, that all makes good sense. What doesn't make sense is when you have your entitlement and then you also have to go to DR, you know, you have your planning entitlement and then you also have to go to DR, but by that point in time, DR has no control and the public thinks that they're still talking about the planning and zoning variance. So sorry, I just repeated myself.
That's okay. We got it.
No, I think this is all really, really, really good discussion. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to talk about when we talk about some of our boards and hearings and anything like that? Because we can move on, and we know that, you know, we are a little bit over time. I didn't want to disrupt the really rich conversation and the experience that you were sharing, because I do think it was really additive. So we can always cover this at a future meeting. But we can go ahead and kind of move on. And then I also want to make sure that if any of our attendees would like to say something at the end, that we give them a little bit of time as well. So Gabby, I'm going to let you go ahead and see what we can do. And if we can't get through it, that's okay. We can always revisit.
Good. I'll talk fast.
That was a short break. That was a 5-second break. Go ahead.
All right. So in addition to discussion we've been having about the reviews of bodies and some of the sort of bigger processes, another major component of making decisions on development applications is the criteria that those applications are reviewed against.
Oh, Gabby, I think we're having a hard time hearing you. You're a little bit garbled.
John, do you just want to take this?
All right, I'll take it. Yeah, I'll do it. How much time do we have, Andrea?
Oh, if we have about 10 minutes just to talk about these particular, and it's okay if we don't get to it, we can always come back because it's important to talk about.
Yeah, let's lay it out here, at least so you can be thinking about it. If we have time to discuss, that's great, but we'll respect your time. So as Gabby was saying, and I had a hard time hearing her too, one of the things that is a very powerful way of improving predictability is the criteria by which you make the decision and the clarity of those criteria. So on the right-hand side, you got some examples about approval criteria. A lot of words. Current code, your current code has a separate criteria for each specific procedure and decision. And again, one of the things that, they go all the way from very broad to very detailed, all the way from must comply with the comprehensive plan to not place an undue burden on transportation, other public facilities in the vicinity. And some are vague and not relevant to that particular procedure. This is a backwater of zoning. It's the unsexy side of zoning. People don't like to talk about it. It makes a huge deal on whether you actually get projects approved that take you where you want to go. So we want to spend some time on it. So that's what you have now. There are trends in this area too. Avoid, and you've heard me rant about this before, these are among my 4 least favorite words in the English language: harmonious, appropriate, contextual, and character. Why? Because it means we're gonna argue about it. It means that we are guaranteed to disagree about whether it's harmonious, whether it's appropriate, whether it's contextual, whether it's in character. And again, the right-hand box is kind of just a definition. It's one that's uniformly verifiable and involves no personal or subjective judgment. I'll tell you as an example, sometimes we have clients who say, we're going to use the word contextual, and then they define contextual. Contextual has to do with the size of the building, the width of the building, the mass of the building, the roof shape of the building, list whatever you want to do, but they tell you what it means. It doesn't mean I don't like the look of this building unless you say the facade, it includes the facade articulation. So the point is to be as objective as possible And the other trend is to avoid, people just throw this word in, consistent with the comprehensive plan, for decisions that are too minor for the plan to give effective guidance or that are by their nature deviations. So variances. Well, what is a variance? A variance is a deviation from the rule. You adopted the rule to implement your plan, and for various reasons, this person is asking to move away from a rule that was designed to implement the plan. It's very hard to say that will implement the plan. What would implement the plan was the rule. Now you're asking for an exception to the rule. I particularly doesn't make sense to say if it's consistent with the comprehensive plan for these types of minor things, or a temporary use or an accessory use. It'd be a very rare comprehensive plan that said, we should really limit the amount of festivals and fairs we have, or car washes are out of control in this town. And so, so be careful. Big decisions, absolutely. Are they required? First of all, the entire code is supposed to be drafted to implement the comp plan. That's the default. When you send things to a public hearing or to city council, it's because reasonable people could disagree, and you need to evaluate this project on its own. And it's valid to say, do we really think this project in this location is going to implement the comprehensive plan? We can really have a disagreement about it, but not on little small things. And often I would say, I would almost add conditional use permits to that list at the bottom. It would be very rare for a comprehensive plan to tell you whether a bed and breakfast is appropriate in a particular neighborhood when it's listed as a conditional use permit in that neighborhood. It usually, they just don't go down there. You know, I cite the part of it that says, hey, this is economic development, and my neighbors cite the part of it that says preserve neighborhood character. It often gives very little guidance that's usable for little projects. So that's another key to getting it right. The trend is to draft general baseline criteria to govern decisions by staff so that you can focus on a particular considerations for that type of application. And then often a criteria for minor amendments for prior approvals. So that instead of having each type of approval say, well, if you want to modify it in the future, here's our one-off bespoke list. We have a list of things called, if you want to modify an approval you've gotten, here are how we evaluate it. It's done by staff, subject to appeal. And if it's a big one, you go right back to the body that you talked to before. And because it's significant enough that we should probably hold the public hearing again, or have the same criteria again. And again, major modifications require repeating, but to come up with a minor and not make them a separate list for each time, saying, let's create a community expectation. What is a little deal to modify something because there's a new builder who's got a slightly different product, or they've gotten something slightly, or they found soil conditions that they didn't think they were going to find. What's minor, what's major? Majors, yes, individualized, probably back at the group that you went to. Minors, not. And then baseline decisions, which are basically the administrative decisions. So again, I want to move on because we want to put this on the table, whether we have time to talk about it today. If we don't today, I really want to talk about it next time. Neighborhood meetings, a common source of misunderstanding or conflicting understandings about what this is about. You're requiring them for quite a long list of things here. And that doesn't make it wrong at all. It just means this is not a trend. This is not a judgment one way or another. This is communicating to those who haven't memorized the code what Boise requires neighborhood meetings for. It's a fairly long list of things. Again, here's what it says now. Neighborhood meetings have to be held no more than 6 months or less than 12 days prior to submitting the application. You can't have a meeting and then file an application a year later. Have to have within 2 miles of the project site, held on Mondays through Thursdays, and start at these times, and a notice delivered as follows. I'm only reminding you of what you say today. That's all. There are trends. Usually the question of this comes up all the time. Shouldn't a city staff member need to be in attendance and or facilitating the meeting? Most codes do not say that. They say that the director gets to decide how to allocate their staff time, and they will assign them when they think it's a large or complex project. And they'll say, I need somebody to go to this meeting. It is pretty rare to say that the planning staff facilitate the meeting. They're often there. Usually it is the presenter, the applicant, who's doing the meeting. Sometimes there's a third party. it is a difficult position to put the city planner in the position of facilitating that meeting, even though I think many times people would like it. It's not typical. It is not in the code, but almost usually clarify what materials have to be presented by the applicant. And by the way, they almost never include things that require you to do engineering, traffic studies, or architectural details. You need to present enough that people can visualize the size, the shape, the location, what it's going to be. It is intended to not require engineering study. Well, how do you know the traffic will be adequate? That's not for a neighborhood meeting. The project is not at that stage yet. And so usually this is clarified better, but it is not at that level. There's usually you got to narrow the gap between how much information it is reasonable to expect at that side in the process. And they clarify who is authorized or required to summarize the discussion. The norm is to say, well, anybody at the meeting can send us a note about it. Some codes say the developer must summarize it, and we trust them to be honest, because if they are dishonest and say, oh, they love my project, they're always subject to some guy coming in and saying, we did not love his project. But usually they clarify it, and usually it's pretty wide open. It's not narrow that one side or the other or one party or another. It is either required of the applicant to summarize, or it is allowed for everybody to summarize if they feel like it. And again, they don't specify, first we're going to hear from this group, then we're going to hear from that group, then we're going to hear from that group. Those are not normal things to put in a code. So with that baseline, I see we have 10 chat questions. That may be enough to keep us going, and I don't want to run us completely out of time, but the 2 questions we'd like you to think about, and maybe we need to bring this back next time, Andrea, is, are there places where you, based on your personal experience, think that the city should adopt more objective decision-making center, or are we wrong? You think they're plenty objective and it would stifle creativity and engagement to make them more objective? And finally, how could we clarify the neighborhood meeting process just so that, when have they worked well? And not counting, well, great applicant, very responsible builder, likes to do this stuff, and so they did it well. When have they been productive when you have, let's say, an average developer or an average builder, an average applicant who is not terribly skilled? What rules would be necessary in that case? And so now we have 11 chats. I'm turning it back over to you, Andrea.
Yes, so to get us kicked off, Richard had pointed out that the city as well, they essentially appointed an advisory committee in 2018 to really look at neighborhood meetings, where we updated some of our noticing and neighborhood meeting requirements. But he did note that that doesn't mean that they can't be improved or clarified. And so this is a really good opportunity to talk about, where is their opportunity to make them better. So I want to hear from Kelly. She has her hand raised, and I know that she had communicated about this at our last meeting as well.
So I'm not sure if this would fit in with the decision-making process, or is this something that needs to be addressed in module 2? But Richard, you in the meeting last night, you brought up a really good discussion about applying the neighborhood plans with these projects that are proposed. And I know that they're a part of Blueprint Boise, which is supposed to, support the comprehensive plan. And I'm curious as how that would fit in with the decision-making process, and how these neighborhood plans, which are really detailed and very well crafted, the ones that I've seen, how can we have them have more teeth in this process?
Andrea, do you want to answer that, or you want me to take a crack at it?
You are welcome to. And then I guess I would also invite Deanna as our past neighborhood planner, who's actually worked on these plans and really talking about what a neighborhood plan is. And, oftentimes they are more visionary and not necessarily intended to have that teeth. But why don't you take it away? And then if Deanna has something she'd like to add, that would be great.
So I would, this will be an interesting discussion based on what you just told me about Deanna and how they work in Boise. In most communities, if the neighborhood plan was adopted by council, it meant council agreed that this was a valid supplement to the comprehensive plan. Now, generally, so it is considered as a criteria. For example, a number of cities say it must be consistent with the comprehensive plan. And by that, they mean our comprehensive plan is the equivalent of Blueprint Boise and neighborhood plans that have been adopted by city council since that time. Most communities say, well, occasionally I've run in, very rarely, occasionally I've run into a neighborhood that does a plan on its own and a vision statement on its own, not authorized by the city. City council never adopted it, and that's not considered a plan. But if it's been adopted by council, the usual approach is to say, then consider it stapled onto the comprehensive plan, and we will consider this when we consider consistency with the comprehensive plan. Caveat: if the comp plan says, if you are directly conflicting with the comp plan, I'm making this up, guys. The comp plan says this neighborhood should be zoned for 5-story buildings, and that's what we intend to approve. And the neighborhood plan says, now we think 3. Usually the comprehensive plan prevails. Neighborhood plans are allowed to supplement and add detail and nuance and geographic specificity, but they are usually, they're not, you don't prevent people from writing the words, but the usual system is to say, when you run into a direct conflict with the city's overall vision for the overall growth of the city, the comprehensive plan is going to be given the heavier weight in that evaluation. So.
All right, we also have Marissa and then Kelly.
So my comment was just on neighborhood meetings, and I, as the NA president, I get like notices of every single neighborhood meeting that happens in the city and the county, and it seems like small projects like ADUs or people building shops, like I'm not 100% sure that those types of projects really need a neighborhood meeting. Like that just might be something that can be a notice to your immediate neighbors, but those types of really small projects that don't impact a community all that much, that might be some way to cut down on those.
Oh, that's great feedback. Thank you.
We had a question in the chat box, Andrea, I can answer pretty quickly. Diane asked, could we talk about the difference between wording something as compliance or not in conflict? Is there a legal difference? Sort of. There is in different states, there are case law. In general, I think the better practice is to draft that, just speak English. If in this case, you need to comply with the following standards, or you need to be consistent with a comp plan. Don't use a double negative, not inconsistent with the negative. That just leaves vague territory in the middle where people are just going to disagree about it. And so the usual phrase is simply to use, you have to comply with a standard and you have to be consistent with a plan.
Does anybody else have any thoughts in regard to neighborhood meetings and where those are done well? I know that I've heard a lot of individuals say, we currently require that a neighborhood meeting be within a certain distance of a site. But I've heard elderly people talk to me and say, hey, it was a rainy, snowy evening and it's slick and I couldn't make it. So is there a way that the city could consider, having it indoors during inclement weather, those types of things? And I don't know if other jurisdictions talk about any of those types of things. Don, do they?
Yes. Well, I have two thoughts. I lost track of a little bit of your question. They're just asking for a different time or date or place for the neighborhood meetings. Is that right?
Yeah, like oftentimes ours are held on the site. And so if it's cold or it's dark or if it's snowy, it kind of prohibits some individuals from being able to participate in the event. And that's ultimately not the goal.
I think it's unusual to do that. I think most of the times it's in a public facility or a basement or a church or a public meeting. And usually it's indoors for exactly that reason. If you want to drive by the site and see it, but frankly, I haven't done research on this, but I'm surprised a little bit at that, because a neighborhood meeting is for conversation back and forth. You can look at the site, but unless you're great at visualization, it's harder for the developer to present what they're doing, and it's hard for people to visualize it on the site. So anyway, that's true. I have some other thoughts we could give on that, but I see we have 3 hands now, so.
Yeah, so we have Kelly, Marissa, and then Esther.
So I'll just be really quick. On the first of all, I would like to have some more time where we can maybe talk offline about my question, Deanna, about the neighborhood plans and how that fits in, because that's a topic that keeps coming up in these meetings that we have, right, with the neighborhoods. And then, I would like to see the meetings with the developers be more of a dialogue. I think if we can discuss how the project fits in with the vision of the neighborhood plan, and if they have one, and then if it deviates from that, and then we have to go through, if there's going to be an opportunity for, hearings and comments and that sort of thing, that would be helpful for the staff to help to be there and help explain, why this, it's a CUP or something, and what the process is, so we can start have the dialogue. But if it's a project that fits in with the plan, then help us understand how it fits in with the plan.
Okay.
Marissa.
I was going to say, I have attended neighborhood meetings in a muddy field on a rainy day before. And it should be in code that they are inside somewhere, and they also should be held at a place that is ADA accessible, because not every place in the community, in our community at least, is that way, and that excludes quite a bit of people that way. And then some of the best neighborhood meetings that I've been to, it really is just dependent on a developer. Like we had one where it was a lady, I don't even recall her name now, but she wanted to build an apartment complex, and she came in basically with her site plan and said, we're not married to this, we can move the buildings around. And she let the neighbors be like, well, if you put this building here, it's going to block my son for, from noon till the sunset. And she actually changed her development based on the neighborhood concerns. But I would really love to see some report back to the city, like these were the neighborhood concerns and this is what we did about it. This is how we address those in our development, so that we can see somehow that those neighborhood meetings have a purpose and that they are relevant to the process.
That's really good feedback. Thank you. Esther?
I agree with Marissa. I have been to a handful of neighborhood meetings on the property site. In a few cases, no information really was handed out that I recall, except for a sign-in sheet. So yeah, because what I've seen in the Collister neighborhood is a developer or the entity that's representing the developer will show up, and they will just want everyone to sign in. And some provide some level of information, others don't. There's one architectural, I think they're like some kind of architectural company that's been doing a lot of work in the Collister and then over off the Pierce Park area. And they've actually been pretty decent. They will send an email to the neighborhood board just saying, hey, we've got this meeting, here's information, can you please share this with your list? And then in the same breath, we've got folks that, I was looking at something that's being reviewed by the city or planning services right now. And I never saw anything, didn't even know that there was any meeting of any sort. It is really, in my experience in the Collister neighborhood in the last 12 years, it's really all over the place.
Ian, how about you?
Yeah, really quickly, I would touch kind of base on what Marissa and Esther were saying. Definitely, if we can have the meetings in a centralized location inside instead of on site, that would not only be better for the participants, but also be better for the architects presenting. It's a lot easier to have something up on the screen or something. In a past life, when I worked on the East Coast, we had these neighborhood committees in the city I was in, and they would effectively have their own little meetings, whether or not they were in a community center or a library. It could kind of depend based on the neighborhood, but I would encourage the city to think about maybe not having it in a centrally located place in Boise, but in an area within those communities, so people can still make those meetings.
Yeah, and in the chat, Kelly has supported that, you know, and identified that, you know, these are all really great points. And Shellen has also recommended that elementary schools and other types of schools are great options. So, all right. Does anybody have anything else? We do have 3 attendees at the meeting. I'm not sure if any of them are interested in chatting with the group, or I'll let them raise their hand if they do have any interest. I'm not seeing anything. So if not, then, you know, I'll let the committee, and do we feel comfortable with some of our discussion? I know that we want to pick back up and talk about some more of this. In addition to that, we've also heard that the committee would like to, or some of the members of the committee would like to actually have perhaps our next meeting like really open, so we can have some fluid dialogue and people can really talk about some of those key issues that are important to them, where they might have some questions. And so we'd love to be able to facilitate that too. So, you know, just really have an open agenda and let you guys talk about what's important to you, or where you think additional information or knowledge needs to be presented or provided to you to make it a good decision. So we'll continue to work with that and keep you apprised as to how that develops. But if anybody doesn't have anything else, I think we've had a really good meeting today. And we want to thank everybody that has been coming to the community engagement events. I think it's really important for you to hear what our community is saying, what we're learning, what our council and our committees are all hearing. All of this contributes to the larger process, and it really is a joint effort between all of us. So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, all.